All right. Should we start?
Yeah.
Anybody who doesn't want us to start may say something now or forever hold their peace. All right. So this talk is called our digital transformation journey with Jenkins, the top 5 don'ts. Honestly, I think this could have used a better name. But you know what, KK and me in the last 7 years that we've been doing this together have talked to a number of customers who have, are on the journey of digital transformation. And we often find them doing the same patterns and same pitfalls. So what we decided to do for this talk is wear the hat of consultants going into a company, and we've amalgamated the 5 don'ts into this mythical company, and we'll be talking through that. Right? So this is the story of CloudBees Bank, right? This is a case study. We have not seen all these use cases in one company. That would be really bad. But at CloudBees Bank, we actually did that. So long ago, CloudBees Bank was the most successful bank in history, right? We were really killing it in the market. We had all the things going on. We were like a 100-year-old company. We had like the market share and so on. And as an employee, the CloudBees Bank employees were really happy. The growth was starting to flatten out, but it wasn't too much of a concern for most employees, right? Typical sort of, modern bank, I guess. But unknowns to us, the CEO was freaking out because what we thought was a flattening of the curve, and I remember I need to be here, flattening of the curve, he saw that as a beginning of a massive downturn that's about to hit the bank. And the challenge for the CEO is typical of most people. Everybody pretty much here resonates with that, is how do you survive in a world where software is eating the world? Right? What do you do? So in the CEO's mind, what was happening was the biggest bank heist in history was taking place, right? There were people making away with gobs of money. There were people making away with their customers, and he really didn't know what to do about it, right? And these people were not your, father's bandits, right? These were, really smart developers employed by their competition, who, for example, were building a mobile deposit function on the mobile app. Like, who the heck wants a mobile deposit function? Why would you use that, right? And once that came out, they found a lot of customers just ran away. So the CEO just, lost all the revenue. Or they are fintech companies, and there were a couple of people who came up on stage earlier on, who exemplify that, right? So there are new fintech companies coming in. They're providing new services. Your stock portfolio can be managed by a program somewhere. Why do you need people? And how do you compete with something like that, right? So these bandits were really smart developers who were, making better services and stealing business away. Now, as CEOs typically do, they got together with his council and, they sat down and they decided that they're going to innovate their way out of this, right? That's what's going to help them make business. They're going to, build new services that are way better than anything that their competition offers, right? Now, that's really, really good news, because what that meant was an entirely new army of developers was going to be unleashed on their enemies, right? Fantastic. And so far, what used to happen was, whereas IT and developers was thought of as a cost center, right? No longer, right? It became a great place, IT was a place where you can now innovate and you can now bring in value and show that. So everybody in IT was really, really celebrating, right? And this is where, KK and me came in, right? We decided. So this is where KK and me came in. And the reason why we came in, because this journey, this IT journey, didn't look like all smooth and roses and so on and so forth. It really did appear as a road to despair, paved with don't do's, and we'll talk about those, right? So the reason why we were hired was the company, seemed to be, executing, they seemed to be delivering, but they really didn't know if they were adding business value, right? And I remember when we started on our digital transformation journey, KK and me actually went to a Agile Scrum Master class. We went to a product manager class, right? So this guy is a certified product manager. And we sat through, the training for a couple of days.
My record is forever tainted.
Yeah, your record is forever tainted. Yes. Yeah. And we walked away, and we came back all enthusiastic. We brought, people in, and suddenly everybody is starting to execute. We sent more managers up there to do the same thing, and sure enough, like everybody comes in, and you're on the path to Agile. Teams are formed, squads are formed, scrums are done. And everybody's paddling fast, but the end, the business value that's coming out, it wasn't really making a whole lot of impact, right? And the question was like, are we effective, or is this an effectiveness problem, or is this an efficiency problem, right? Seem to be throwing stuff on the conveyor belt, and on the other side, it lands into a garbage bin. So with that, this brings me to, so we came in, we analyzed, and here are the 6 don't do's. So we'll start with one, the first one. This was about ad hoc processes. And what I mean about this is sort of letting processes evolve organically, right? So when you start off, in the beginning, nobody wants processes. Like, there's no man who would say yes to more processes, right? So you start off, and a great use case was, I was talking to one of these customers, is that they were trying to, this was a shared IT team. They were setting up Jenkins across for people. And as they did that, they wanted more and more people to come on to the shared IT services team. And when they went to various people and asked, can you come, you are running your own Jenkins, we'll manage that for you, can you come on board? And the response always was like, why would we do that? You're going to take away all our flexibility, so we don't want that. And the shared IT team, in this case, would come in and say like, don't worry, we'll take care of any plugins. If you don't want to update those plugins, we won't bother you, we'll support you. And they did that for every new team coming on board. And very soon, in a few months, they were running 35, 40 snowflakes. And after a point, they could not upgrade their masters. They could not manage this as a service, right? It would have been good if you had the CloudBees managed service program then, but like this was a big problem, right? And the question really is like, people talk very different languages. Processes are very different with different teams. And when you let them evolve organically, it's not a great place to be in. You had a story to share.
Right. So another example is, well, we started adopting these, let's say, agile practices in different teams, and then we let the teams have retrospect and evolve their processes on their own, which is, in a sense, it's great that each team has flexibility and freedom to sort of choose how they like to work. But in no time, what we discover is that different teams are diverging into the different practices. So from outside, the different teams are almost like different companies. There's no consistency between them. Like hiring people into different teams or moving people around is incredibly hard. So growing this processes organically and then let the teams kind of decide the fate completely had certain downside. That's I think that was my discovery.
All right. Next one is no standardization. So what I mean by this is, I think of DevOps as a set of islands, and these islands are interconnected with each other with CI, right? So Jenkins sits right in there. And each of these islands actually is a series of villages, right? So the source code management island will have like a state that's called Git, and it has a number of cities in there, GitHub and Atlassian Bitbucket and so on, right? So there are tribes in each of these sort of villages that are extremely passionate about their tools, right? And go try tell someone to ditch the tool that they are using and use something else, and you have a problem, right? And not sort of standardizing tools, this kind of flows into what you were saying earlier. Not standardizing tools is a problem, right? The one that really, really resonates with me, and I lived that for like 2.5 years of this, was we used to have Redmine as a ticketing system. How many of you actually use that? All right, one guy, brave guy. And it was fairly okay. And then at some point, Trello became the hip thing, and somebody brought in Trello, and soon our tickets were flowing through these two systems. We are coordinating them. Then we decided this is not ideal. We brought another tool in, and eventually we moved to Jira. So for about 2.5 years, all the tickets were spread across these 4 systems because, well, we didn't have enough time to migrate stuff over, or when you're migrating, you couldn't really migrate this status from here and that status from there. And it became really, really painful. And not to mention the cost of the IT team supporting these 4 tools and keeping things ready, right? So that was another one for me.
Right, and then for me, so this got the CI right in the center, but sometimes different teams can use Jenkins in a very, very different way, right? So it's almost to the point of one person administering one Jenkins doesn't necessarily understand how another one is put together. It is a problem because the hard-earned knowledge in the one instance, one master, does not translate to other teams that's using Jenkins. So it starts to feel the cost of not sharing the same standardized tool set, which is supposed to enable the scalability, but it doesn't. And that creates this painful everyone reinventing the wheel world.
Right. The third one is bad architecture, right? And I think you're talking to this.
Right. Yeah. So when you start to putting too much workload into one master, it just takes more effort to keep that up and running more stably. Coordinating changes gets harder. Like a lot of small friction starts to add up. And when you inevitably fail to meet some of these, the hard work, the experience starts to suffer for the developers. And that's really bad when you're trying to encourage people to do more automations with this thing, and then the tool come across as unstable and unreliable. Like that's the first thing that they use as an excuse to kind of bring their work to go somewhere else or take on some other priorities. So I see many places the initial success of building a skyscraper start to crumble, and then they sort of struggle around that. I think it's
this is a Leaning Tower of Pisa, by the way.
It's yeah. So wait, does that mean it's actually stable enough? They could keep it going for maybe 1,000 years? The bad
Trust you to
metaphor.
throw that out. Okay. Yeah. Actually, to that point, we've seen actually customers who had at least a few thousand and tens of thousands of jobs running on their masters. And every time we would go in and they would have a problem and we go in and give them a solution, they would come back and say no, we can't touch that. Because if we touch that, we're going to impact so many teams, right? And it's so what do we do here, right? The next one is ignoring best practices.
Yeah, so one of the teams I went to see, they had this this big Jenkins instance. They were creating this server software, and they needed to run these distributed tests. Right? So instead of using Jenkins to just run the test a normal way, I guess somebody in the team came up with this great idea to have a Jenkins job representing primitives of the test, reloading the service, starting them, stopping them, collecting logs, or running tests and so on. So every test case was translated into 10 or so different jobs in one folder, and that's just for one test case. So they have 400 or so test cases, meaning they have 4,000 jobs, all connected with this web of upstream jobs, downstream jobs. So when you trigger one job, this cascading things happen and every test case runs, which is great if you think about it, but it's really horrible at the same time because no one else is doing anything like that, right? So instead of focusing on writing tests and running tests, they had to create this, the custom solution around this ever-growing problem, like the fact that they have 400 test cases, meaning they have to come up with their own templating language to generate Jenkins jobs. And at that point, are you hacking Jenkins or are you writing or running tests, right? it's kind of like you have to start wondering, is it what you want to do, or do you want to work for CloudBees, right? So
was this
yeah.
was this like one project, or this was?
Yes, this was one project.
All right,
yeah.
so that's going across for multiple projects.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
yeah. So sometimes having a smart people can be a problem.
Yeah, that's that is true. All right, so on that similar vein, there's a brittle glass sitting up there, so I need to set that up. What we also come across with people was when they're using these jobs, there are 4,000 jobs, and there's jobs that are running multiple days. You're doing CD pipeline that run into days, and jobs were not meant to survive Jenkins master or agent failures. And so when something like that happens, there's an escalation that comes back that says like, hey, this is, your infra is not stable, and the IT team takes a brunt, right? And there's clearly a solution out there with pipelines sitting up there, but people aren't using it. And so there's resistance to the best practice, and the most common answer that I have seen is really about, we're running so fast, we have to deliver so fast that we cannot pause and redo this thing. And I'm kind of hearing this in off and on conversations between people, where the trend seems to be the same. We spent time building this, and now it's like I don't know if you've seen the Stephen Covey's sharpening the saw. We cannot stop to sharpen the saw, so we're going to keep breaking the tree down with a very blunt axe. We're going to spend 6 hours doing it, but God, we're going to get that done, right? And so that's another problem. The next one is, in some ways, no right tools, or using tools the wrong way. And this is not as much as a people problem, but it's much more a tool problem. And we've talked about some of this today. The way I think about this is, when Kosuke came up with Jenkins, there was a person, a release manager role, right, that's becoming less and less prevalent. At that time frame, the person's job really was to be this human dashboard of indicating the status of how are commits coming in, how are these commits, like, is this green yet, is this red yet, have I integrated all these pieces together? And this Jenkins dashboard replaced all of that, right? But what the Jenkins dashboard wasn't sort of set up to do was become this collaborative tool around software delivery, right? So when I now look at this I'm on the blue team, I look at the blue ball there, there's an email that goes out, I talk to somebody about there. The red team has its own set of processes. When it sees a blue or a red ball, it has conversations on email, then Slack, and then they come back here to the Jenkins page, and they're collaborating around this. And that's not what Jenkins was sort of meant to start off with. And so people have pushed it in ways, and I think Jenkins hasn't kept pace as much. So that's one of the things. And the surest signs that I have seen that people have pushed it beyond what it was meant to do is where they come in and they use Jenkins as the API layer, and then build a completely a complete sort of tier on top of it that's really customized to their teams. And again, they'll have like a few dozen developers building this new sort of UX on top, trying to do stuff that frankly Jenkins should have solved in some ways. The last one is bad metrics, and I don't know whether no metrics is better than bad metrics, but it's like we've come across, right, as people have gone in and tried to do continuous delivery, what we see is they have put all these investments, and then at some point the engineering managers are coming up and talking about, are we effective, are we pushing out the right things? And it starts off with no metrics, and there's not enough effective metrics being shown to people. And so people start inventing some stuff. One of the ones that I personally resonated with me was in this company where they set up the CD infrastructure, and they really had to show how effective CD is. And they came up to the conclusion that, well, number of builds on the system is a good metric to show how many, how good they are on continuous delivery, right? And it showed up on a dashboard somewhere. And so very soon, you had like number of bills running across your system being the effective metric across the organization. And everybody is measured on it. And so you can imagine the sort of disaster that it starts leading to, right?
See, that was my business plan at Sun, is like, with more people putting workloads, selling more hardware. That would have been great.
Yeah. All right. So with all these sort of problems up there, I felt like what CloudBees Bank had tasked Kosuke and me to do was to unleash this developer army and take them on the other side of to the promised land. And what we did was we built this shaky sort of infrastructure where everybody is sort of falling into the cliff. And the way we found that we had hit rock bottom was it was an absolute wild west out there. And what I mean by that was like things are not working when you're trying to bring in DevOps and this culture around, is when there's constant finger pointing going on, right? So a use case that we know about is this customer had the central IT team, and they got they had good success. They got a lot of people, about 60 or 70% of the organization on this IT infrastructure. They didn't have all the problems that we mentioned, but they did have some. But there was one sort of team that had the CEO's budget and the CEO's eyes, who were not doing best practices. They were running their own shadow IT, who were, they were not following any of the processes. And so they were inventing these processes going along. And when things failed, they would point to the central IT service saying like, you need to support me. You are the bottleneck. And it was an extremely, toxic environment when this was happening. So now that we've kind of ended up in the trough of despair, we could leave and people are depressed and go home. That would be sweet justice in some ways, subjecting them to listen to us. But how did we sort of rise out of this, right? So the first real thing that we realized, and the next couple of slides may sound pithy, is really getting everyone on the same page, right? When you go within an organization and talk to people about software delivery, about DevOps, it's like the blind men and the elephant story. Everybody's feeling a different part of the elephant, and they describe the elephant completely differently, right? If you even go to your own teams, and even if this is a pizza-sized team, and you ask them, you'll find that they are on different pages. So the only thing to do here is to come in and break the silos, right? And this is talked really often, like we should break silos between people. And this was your pet subject when you actually brought in pipelines. The idea that people have is, well, we'll get the dev and the ops guys, or maybe the dev and the dev guys, to come in and sit together. We'll sit down, have a beer, and we'll all walk out actually really happy, right? And that seems to be the extent of most people, what people do. I remember meeting a customer a couple of Jenkins world ago, where there was like two guys walked in. One was dev and the other one is ops, and they said like, all that's happened is like 3 levels up. A VP now owns dev and ops, and the organization is called DevOps, and nothing has changed. So they expect everything to work like, and suddenly they should get efficiencies, right? So what Kosuke was talking about when we came up with pipeline is, it's not just enough to say these guys should work together. The tools should provide certain things that facilitate these conversations, right? And that's what we talk about by breaking silos. And the next set of things is what we think we brought to the table to help break these silos, and how tools can make your life better, right? So the first one is how do you find right processes, right? And there's a whole lot of things in a whole lot of places from a process perspective. But where we came in with was DevOptics Deliver, right? Because we saw the need ourselves as we were building it, right? And as if you saw this in the keynote on the Microsoft slide, its continuous delivery is not just one pipeline. It's not just one team. It's connecting people across multiple sort of interconnected pipelines, finding these teams out and seeing how software is delivered through these phases, right? And so that's where we felt like helping people draw this value stream, and getting teams to sit together and map this value stream together sort of becomes the first point in sort of facilitating conversation on how should software be delivered. This is how we do it, how should we improve, right? So that's sort of where we came up with DevOptics Deliver.
Right, and when I kind of go back to the early days of Jenkins, one of my the key sort of goal that I wanted to do is, I noticed that the developers spending a lot of time sort of talking to each other, passing information from one side to the another, right, and going back and forth. And by having this software that's called Jenkins and having the result that you can see that every page has a separate URL, those people don't need to tell each other, hey, I have a new build I want you to test. Right? They can kind of get on the same page just by having this tool without doing any further work on their own. So, some of the insight that went into DevOptics, I think is coming from the similar ground. I noticed that obviously people are automated and build and test, that's fine. But still, there's lots of information sharing that has to happen between different teams now. That, hey, I have a new release that I need you to use. It contains these changes. Or when I produce my bits, I have to wait until somewhere later the larger scale system integration gets run by another team, because we know that that test might break some of the things we changed. So tracking that information, making sure that the people who are impacted by your work knows what you've done, and that sort of things is costing people time and sort of conscious effort. So in DevOptics Deliver, like you saw this morning, it's like a flow of the changes going from left to right across different teams. One of my goals is for that to basically eliminate the need, or substantially reduce the need for people to communicate, and then just let the tool being there do that for you.
Right. What I particularly liked about it, given that I was doing the demo, was the fact that you're looking at issues flowing through the system, right? And the conversation evolves from, hey, I don't know what's really happening, to I know exactly what's happening, right? And this is, I think, your goal, as I've heard you say this multiple times. Your goal with Jenkins was to facilitate sort of a higher quality of collaboration conversation, and I think that's what DevOptics Deliver sort of does here. So that's one. The second one, it was on standardization, right? And what we've seen people do successfully, the people who have been on the journey of are successfully executing on the journey of digital transformation, they usually, and I picked this from a customer of ours, and it's a big bank, they standardize on the big 4 or the big 5, right? You cannot go in and standardize every island out there. That's a losing battle, right? So what you want to do is you want to figure out as a central IT team, or what are the tools that are really critical for your success, right? You get the 80% of people on those tools, and then you may have like these other smaller sort of use cases on other sort of islands, on villages, that you may optionally support, but getting most of the organization onto those tools is really important, right? Because then you can start bringing in sort of your learnings, you can start leveraging sort of the advantages of scale and help more and more people with that, right? So typically what we've seen in these big 4 and big 5, the top 3 here are usually CloudBees, GitHub, and Jira. So that's one of the things, and I think this conversation perhaps is one of the most difficult conversations that happen in a company, because people are out with their pitchforks to burn you if something you're not supporting their tool.
Like VI and Emacs.
VI and Emacs, yeah. That's you're too old. Right. All right. So the next one was right architecture, right? So we talked about the bad architecture and the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and this is a story that Kosuke and me have talked multiple years, right? And the goal for us is really with this distributed pipeline architecture is to get people to think that you don't scale vertically, you should scale horizontally, right? And the notion with the distributed pipeline architecture here was that what you really want to do is think about getting every team separate from each other. They should have their own pipelines. These should be completely separate from each other such that a failure on one team does not create a failure on another, right? And I remember seeing this in a support ticket at CloudBees at some point where somebody in there ran a Groovy script that did a system exit in one team, and he brought the service down for hundreds of developers. You don't want that, right? So having this distributed pipeline architecture is critical, right? And that's where we've gone in and built CloudBees Jenkins Enterprise. And the idea for us was to actually just help make creating these distributed pipeline architectures turnkey, right? I showed that on the keynote. But the goal here is you give us a cloud of machines, and we will come in and orchestrate that machines. We will multi-tenant it, and as Sasha showed, like we ran 2,000 masters and 10,000 executors on 300 VMs. We have built the intelligence to sort of help do that. Failovers are taken care of for you. It is elastic, so you can add more machines and scale up and down. So we do all of that, and then we have a nice management tier which helps sort of Jenkins administrator manage all this infrastructure at scale, right? And so just do a distributed pipeline architecture out of the box and just get on with it, and you don't have to worry about the Leaning Tower of Pisa anymore. Then on this line you had something.
Right, and Advisor that we launched earlier today, right? This free service for every Jenkins user out there. That's also coming for the similar benefit. We want to make sure that you as a busy Jenkins admin can use Jenkins in the right way more easily without spending too much time babysitting it. So that way your developer can start putting a workload more successfully. So what the Advisor does is, it's keeping an eye on your Jenkins instance, and then whenever it starts to develop some symptom of a problem, even if it doesn't result in any catastrophic failure, then it'll tell you that, hey, there's something going on here, you might want to look into it. So you can prevent the problem by nipping that in the bud, and they provide a better experience for users.
Right. So now that we have pitched product all through here, so let's sort of say that this is actually available for free, so you can just install this plugin, and all the lessons that we've learned sort of as CloudBees support, right? It's matching up those lessons. It scans the plugin scans your Jenkins. It matches up those lessons that we've learned and provides you data saying like, look, you need to read this knowledge base article because such and such thing is going wrong on your system. You may not have a problem today, but in the future, you will. So I'd urge you to just download it and try it out. So the next one was write tools, and best practices, right? Sorry, and I hinted towards this, right? Again, we see a lot of resistance from people employing best practices because there's so many other things that are going on, right? So one of our themes with the product has been to actually just make best practices turnkey. But the biggest one, I think, from my takeaway from people here is if you're using sort of freestyle jobs, you should really be looking into pipelines, right? It is the notion of capturing your continuous delivery pipeline through code. I don't know if you want to talk about that. Through code such that it can be checked in and you can actually version it. You can see how it's evolving. Those are really key, right? And as CloudBees, we spend a lot of time in open source making pipelines better. So we built in declarative pipelines. How many here kind of knew about declarative pipelines? All right, that's a small set. So declarative pipelines was like this. What's your analogy about katas? Katas.
All right. I don't know, but I can do it.
Right. So the idea here was to help people, like, give them sort of configured, declarative syntax so that they can easily build these pipelines. And then we've spent a lot of time building this pipeline editor so that it's very easy for people to get started. Now, I call this sort of the democratization of CD trend that's happening. So when we started off a couple of years ago, not as many developers were actually building these pipelines, and you talked about that in your keynote. But in the last year and a half, we see the expectation is that developers want to go in and build these pipelines, and they want to be enabled doing that. So if you're not using pipelines, you should really be considering them. So moving on to the next best practice, write tools, right? And if you remember, this was like using Jenkins in ways that you would kind of not imagined originally. So
yeah, so again, I kind of touched upon this earlier, but the earlier on, like Jenkins job was creating a right frame for conversation. Like that was something the QA people and the developer can use to say, hey, like your changes that you made 3 days ago or like 3 minutes ago have broken these test cases, and they can get on the same page quickly. So as the automation got more complicated, I feel like that the right level of abstraction kind of went up. So the DevOptics Deliver, in my mind, is partially, in part, our approach, like our attempt to kind of gain back that right level of abstraction, like arming people with the right context so that they could say, those changes that came from this team 2 days ago through this release is now seems to be the cause of the new test that was broken in the production environment. Right? So that allows people to instantly sort of gather around and think about what next to do without spending time figuring out all these individual Jenkins jobs to understand what actually happened. So that to me is sort of using the right tool to solve that problem.
Right, and we saw this with our DevOptics Deliver team itself, right? After a while, the Scrum meetings, they're starting to use DevOptics Deliver to understand what the status of various things within the pipeline was to deliver, and that was kind of a nice unexpected side benefit. Like it's so much easier to find out what's happening by the state of the system. Why do you want to go through 3 or 4 systems to figure that out? They started using that in their Scrum planning meetings, which was quite interesting. The next one, which I feel fairly passionate about, is the notion of teams that I talked about earlier, right? And I really thought something has been sorely missing in Jenkins for a while. So I call it, quote unquote, our grand plan. We wanted to move Jenkins from jobs to pipelines to applications, and we kind of did that here today. Not kind of, we have done that. But the other notion that's been missing sorely from Jenkins has the notion of teams, right? People work in the context of teams. They don't work in the context of pipelines and jobs and Jira projects. They're tools to help them make better, right? So what we are trying to do here is we are trying to bring the notion of teams and make it first class for CloudBees Jenkins. And the idea here is that when you're setting up this distributed pipeline architecture and a new initiative comes on board and you form the first team to go do that, it should be, it should be dead simple. It should just take you literally minutes to do that, as opposed to what we were finding out was one of the reasons why people ended up on Leaning Tower of Pisas was like, it's hard to set up all this infrastructure, right? It's hard to make it scalable. So what they're trying to do here is like, we've got this going, let's keep this going some more, right? And we wanted to get away from that, right? So CJE UX for Teams kind of lets you do that. The next bit is about metrics, right? And helping people choose right metrics. And so this is again another sort of take on DevOptics Deliver that we have. But the goal here with DevOptics Deliver, and I think we're going back to it a number of times, when we started sort of answering those questions, if you remember, you're throwing so much on the pipe, on the conveyor belt, we don't know if this is effective or efficient, right? It's like, what do you measure? Do you measure builds per day to see how effective you are, right? And clearly that was not the answer, right? So our goal here was that Well, we'll start with the delivery stream view, which we've talked. And the next set of items is to actually kind of help you understand better what your cycle time across your teams are, what your cycle times within a team are. But even before you get there, like what we think is with the DevOptics Deliver kind of enables you with the view that we've come up today to tell you exactly, sort of have that conversation that I was talking about with people. What does continuous delivery mean? How does that matter, right? So those are the kinds of conversation we want to enable here. The next thing that we're going to talk about, and we are actually working on, and Sasha announced this in his keynote, was DevOptics Pulse, right? And the goal with DevOptics Pulse here is, as you saw with the number of builds being used as a mechanism to tell you how fast you're operating, but number of builds is a good metric to tell you how scalable your Jenkins is. If you can run more builds, your Jenkins is doing right. So it's not the metric that's wrong, it's the place where it's being used. So DevOptics Pulse is actually going to tackle the tier of helping you run Jenkins better. And that's the direction where we are going in. And you see some sort of mocks from product work in progress now, which tells you sort of what your runs across your entire CloudBees Jenkins enterprise infrastructure looks like, right? Then you can kind of go down the teams aspect and now go in and have a very different conversation and say, like, as a Jenkins admin, I know that I'm supporting these 5 teams, and look at the load of these 5 teams. I know there's something going wrong with team, foo, because the JVM size is so much and so forth. And it provides the right context for the Jenkins administrator to solve the problems of people they support. Here's another take on another report that we're going to pull together. It's kind of giving you a very clear insight as a Jenkins admin on what the peak times are for the builds on the system and so on, right? So the goal here is to actually help you sort of make this understand how your Jenkins is operating. So once you kind of tackle each of these issues as you go along, you kind of end up to from the road to despair to a much more happier place on the other side, right? And the way you do that, in my mind, I wanted to call this out. The way I think you should be running your ideal software factory, and is on the chimney, which is a not very eco-friendly terminology to use for a software factory. You have CloudBees Jenkins Enterprise is providing you the scalable service. The reason you're doing that is going back to your standardization. Jenkins is that island that connects most of the other islands out there. You're using CJE teams to help make your customers, your developers happier to go in and deliver business value. And on the left-hand side is DevOptics that helps you understand what's going on, right? So at the bottom, you have CloudBees Jenkins Advisor that's helping you sort of proactively tell you and flag issues. There may be something coming down the way that might create problems for you. There's DevOptics Pulse that'll tell you the state of the world, the pulse of your Jenkins running now. And then there's DevOptics Deliver that tells you how your continuous delivery system is running, right? So, and there's more to come in the future. So if you kind of did all of this, and there's some tools that are not there, but if you did all of this, you end up from this world where things were being thrown in the garbage dump to, there's a diamond coming on the other side and your customers are happy, right? So this brings me to the end of the talk, right? So what's the lesson and what's the summary, right? So here are the things that you need to think about. And I'm sure every one of you has one or two that you can do here. Just figure out if you're using the right processes, should you be reviewing them? Do you need to standardize on some tools and perhaps stop supporting some other tools? Do you have the right architecture? I bet most of you don't have one. Are you using the best practices? Are you using the tools the right way? Are they right metrics, right? So the summary for me is this, getting Jenkins to run well, your DevOps culture, it always starts with the culture, right? It's always about getting people in and talking about the culture. And the tools come next. But boy, they are important. Do you want to add something?
No, let's keep on this conversation by, going to the CloudBees booth. There are a lot of people who can talk about these things. They saw these things real in action. So
All right.
looking forward to do that.
Thank you.